My name is Elizabeth May Carson. I was 8 years old when my stepfather Robert Wheeler's fist connected with my jaw, the impact lifting my 60-pound body clean off the ground and sending me crashing into the wooden cabinet where my mother kept her few precious dishes. The sound of breaking ceramic filled the kitchen as plates and bowls exploded around me, their fragments cutting my arms and face while I tried desperately to crawl away from Robert's towering rage. "Spilled the goddamn milk again, you worthless little brat!" Robert's voice boomed through our collapsing farmhouse, each word punctuated by the sound of his heavy work boots against the splintered wooden floor. "Third time this week. Maybe a night with the pigs will teach you some respect for the food that keeps you alive." He grabbed my ankle with one massive hands that had grown strong from years of wrestling with farm equipment and stubborn cattle, and dragged me across the broken glass toward the back door. I could feel ceramic shards embedding themselves in my skin, could taste blood from where I'd bitten my tongue during the initial blow, could hear my own whimpering voice. The year was 1953, and this was supposed to be my third night locked in the pig pen behind our barn, shivering in my torn cotton dress, while the animals snorted and shuffled around me in the darkness. Robert had discovered this particular punishment 6 months earlier, after a beating had left me with bruises visible enough to prompt questions from Mrs. Patterson at the schoolhouse. But something was different this time. As Robert's boots disappeared back toward the farmhouse, as I heard the familiar sound of the kitchen door slamming shut and the lock turning to trap me outside until morning, I made a decision that would change the entire trajectory of my life. I ran. My bare feet. "Get back here, you little brat Elizabeth. Get back here right now or I'll kill you when I catch you." The threat wasn't empty posturing. Robert's violence had been escalating. I dove between the dried cornstalks, just as Robert's massive hand swiped at my hair, missing by inches. The sharp leaves cut my face and arms as I crawled deeper into the maze of dead plants, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Robert thrashed. "When I catch you, girl, you're gonna wish you were never born. Nobody runs from me. Nobody." I pressed my face into the dirt and held my breath, listening to his heavy boots stomp past me. The rumble of a truck engine on County Road 15 was barely audible above the wind, but to my 8-year-old ears, it sounded like salvation itself. Without thinking about consequences or destinations, I scrambled to my feet and ran toward that sound, toward the possibility of a life that didn't involve daily beatings and nightly imprisonment with farm animals. I burst from the cornfield just as a cattle hauler rounded the bend, its headlights cutting through the November darkness like searchlights seeking lost souls. The driver, a weathered man named Earl Hutchins, slammed on his brakes when he saw me stumbling into the road, my face bloodied and my dress torn to shreds. "Sweet Jesus, child," Earl said as he jumped down from his cab, his voice carrying the gentle concern of someone who'd raised daughters of his own. "What in God's name happened to you?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't speak. The trauma of the evening, combined with months of accumulated fear and abuse, had left me mute with exhaustion and terror. Earl Hutchins proved to be exactly the kind of man my 8-year-old heart needed to encounter in that desperate moment. He wrapped me in a thick blanket from his truck's cab, shared his thermos of coffee, despite my chattering teeth, and asked no probing questions about the bruises on my face or the fear in my eyes. Instead, he simply drove through the night toward Denver, Colorado, letting me sleep in his "You running from something bad, little girl?" Earl asked as we passed through Colorado Springs at sunrise, the Rocky Mountains rising like protective walls around us. I nodded, still unable to trust my voice. The kindness in his weathered face made me want to tell him everything about Robert's escalating violence, about my mother's death. Well, Earl said quietly, his eyes reflecting years of experience with the darker aspects of human nature. Sometimes running is the smartest thing a person can do. Takes courage to leave everything familiar, even when familiar means dangerous. You just be careful who you trust out there, okay? He dropped me off at a truck stop on the outskirts of Denver, pressing a $20 bill into my small hand despite my protests. "Get yourself some food and find a safe place to sleep," he said. "And if you ever need help again, you look for another trucker. We take care of our own, and that includes little girls who remind us of our daughters back home." Earl Hutchins disappeared back into his world of highways and loading docks, but his kindness had planted a seed of hope in my traumatized young heart. Not all adults were like Robert Wheeler. Some people in this world actually cared about protecting children rather than hurting them. Denver, in 1953, was a sprawling city that seemed impossibly large and dangerous to a girl who'd never seen a building taller than the grain elevator in our county seat. The streets were crowded with cars and buses belching black smoke, the sidewalks filled with people who moved with purpose and urgency that left no room for. I spent my first night in the city huddled in the doorway of a closed diner, clutching Earl's $20 bill and jumping at every sound. When police officers found me the next morning, I was so cold and frightened that I could barely speak coherently enough to explain how I'd arrived in their city. "Oh, what's your name, honey?" asked Officer Patricia Gonzalez, a woman in her 30s whose gentle voice and patient demeanor reminded me painfully of my mother before tuberculosis had stolen her strength. "Where are your parents?" I gave them my real name, Elizabeth Carson, because I was too young and too exhausted to think of convincing lies. But when they asked about my family, I found myself creating a story that felt true, even though it wasn't factual. In a sense, this wasn't really a lie. Sarah was dead, and Robert had never been a real father to me anyway. I was an orphan in every way that mattered, regardless of legal definitions or biological connections. The Denver Children's Home was a substantial brick building that housed 63 children ranging in age from infancy to 17 years old. The dormitories were crowded and institutional, but they were also warm and safe with regular meals and adults who. Mrs. Adelaide Foster, the head matron, was a stern woman in her 60s who'd spent 30 years caring for displaced children. She took one look at my injuries and had the home's doctor examine me thoroughly, documenting every bruise and cut for what she called the permanent record. "Someone hurt you very badly," Dr. Reynolds told me as he wrapped my ribs with fresh bandages. Do you want to tell us who did this to you? I shook my head, sticking to my fabricated story about the car accident. The truth was too complicated, too shameful, too frightening to share with strangers who might not believe. Life at the children's home was structured and predictable in ways that felt miraculous after the chaos of Robert's farm. We woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of Sister Margaret's bell, attended mandatory classes in mathematics, reading and practical skills, performed assigned chores that contributed to the home's operation, and gathered for evening meals. That I shared dormitory space with 7 other girls sleeping on a narrow cot with clean sheets and a warm blanket, luxury I hadn't experienced since my mother's final illness had left her too weak to maintain basic household standards. The other girls came from similarly tragic backgrounds: abandonment, abuse, family deaths that had left children with nowhere else to go. But even surrounded by institutional kindness and predictable safety, I remained hypervigilant, studying every adult's facial expressions and body language for signs of impending violence. The trauma of 8 years with Robert Wheeler had taught me that apparent kindness could disappear without warning, transformed into rage that could destroy small bodies. That's when Mrs. Dorothy Patterson entered my life, though I wouldn't understand the true significance of her presence for many years. Dorothy was a volunteer in her 50s who came to the children's home 3 times a week to teach older children practical skills, like Elizabeth. She said during our first individual session, "You watch people very carefully. Like you're always calculating distances to exit doors, always preparing for something bad to happen." She was absolutely correct. Even surrounded by genuine kindness, I couldn't shake the feeling that safety was temporary, that violence was always lurking just around the corner, waiting to reclaim. Some children learn early that the world can be cruel, Dorothy told me one afternoon as we practiced balancing a household budget. The trick is learning to protect yourself without shutting out everyone who might genuinely want to help you heal. What I didn't know then was that Dorothy's presence at St. Catherine's wasn't coincidental or randomly charitable. Years later, she would tell me the truth she had been searching for me, specifically following clues and rumors across multiple states, until she finally tracked me down in Denver. Dorothy Patterson was my grandmother, though I wouldn't learn this devastating and wonderful fact until much later. My mother, Sarah, had been her daughter, and Dorothy had been conducting a methodical search for both Sarah and me for nearly a decade. On my 16th birthday, March 15, 1961, Dorothy offered me something I'd dreamed about since arriving at St. Catherine's, a real job in the outside world that would allow me to earn money for my eventual independence. The Frontier Hotel downtown, the manager's name is Stanley Kowalski, Dorothy explained as I nodded eagerly, too focused on the prospect of earning real money to pay proper attention to the warning embedded in her words. At 16, I thought I could handle any adult who might try to intimidate or manipulate me. After all, I'd survived Robert's systematic violence and 8 years in institutional care. How dangerous. The Frontier Hotel occupied a full city block on East Colfax Avenue, a 4-story brick building that had been genuinely elegant during Denver's early boom years, but now catered to traveling salesmen, construction workers, and long-term residents who couldn't afford better accommodations. The lobby featured worn burgundy carpet, mismatched furniture that had seen better decades, and a front desk where a man in his 30s sat reading a racing form while smoking cigarettes that left the air thick with acrid blue smoke. "So you're the girl from St. Catherine's?" he said, looking up as Dorothy and I approached the desk. I'm Stanley Kowalski. I manage this place for the owner. Stanley was perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair that showed premature thinning sharp features that might have been handsome in different circumstances, and eyes that assessed me with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating merchandise rather than meeting a prospective employee. His white shirt was clean but wrinkled his tie slightly askew, and his overall appearance suggested a man who was trying to maintain professional standards despite personal circumstances that made such maintenance challenging. The job is straightforward housekeeping, he explained, leading us through the lobby toward the elevator that would take us to the guest floors. 48 rooms, $4 was more money than I'd ever possessed at one time, enough to begin saving for the independence I'd dreamed about, since understanding that children's homes were temporary havens rather than permanent solutions. Yes, sir, I can definitely handle that kind of work. Good. You start this Saturday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Stanley leaned forward slightly, and I caught a whiff of cologne mixed with something less pleasant, the sour smell of someone who'd been drinking the night before. One important thing to remember in this business: discretion is absolutely essential. Our guests value their privacy. Yes, sir, perfectly clear. But as Dorothy and I left the hotel and walked toward the bus stop, I noticed she kept glancing back at the building with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not just maternal concern, but something approaching genuine fear. Elizabeth, she said as we— Why? I asked, suddenly alert to the seriousness in her tone. Is he dangerous? Do you know something about him that I should know? Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, watching traffic pass on the busy street, while she seemed to wrestle with how much truth to share. Some men see young girls as opportunities rather than people, Elizabeth. They look for girls who are alone in the world, who don't have family support systems that might ask uncomfortable questions or demand accountability. Just promise me you'll be very, very careful. I promised, but I was too focused on the independence that $4 a day would bring to take her warning as seriously as I should have. For the first time since— The work at the Frontier Hotel was exactly what Stanley had described during my interview: routine housekeeping tasks that required more physical energy than actual skill. I cleaned 10 to 12 rooms per shift, learning to work efficiently around guests who were often still sleeping off hangovers entertaining visitors they didn't want the front desk to know about, or conducting business. Stanley was consistently friendly during those first few weeks, complimenting my work ethic and attention to detail, occasionally buying me a Coca-Cola from the lobby vending machine, and treating me with the kind of professional respect that made me feel genuinely valued as an employee. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, his behavior began changing in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. His compliments shifted from my work performance to my appearance. His casual touch as a hand on my shoulder when reviewing my cleaning checklist, fingers brushing against mine when he handed me supplies, lasted longer than necessary and felt qualitatively different from innocent workplace contact. You're growing up to be a real pretty girl, Elizabeth, he told me one evening as I finished cleaning the third-floor rooms. Much prettier than most of the women who come through this place, that's for certain. I blushed and mumbled appropriate thanks, uncomfortable with the personal attention, but not understanding why it felt wrong. At 16, I was dangerously naive about men and their intentions, particularly men who seemed genuinely interested in my welfare and future prospects. Stanley's manipulation was skillful and remarkably patient. He began finding legitimate-sounding excuses to be present in rooms while I was cleaning them. A growing girl needs proper nutrition? He said, sliding into the booth across from me at Murphy's Diner on a Friday evening when my shift had run particularly late. You're too skinny for your height. We need to put some meat on those bones if you're— His attention was flattering in a way that my emotionally starved adolescent heart craved desperately. No adult had ever shown such sustained personal interest in my well-being, such apparent concern for my future, beyond the basic necessities of food and shelter. Stanley gradually created a sense of intimacy between us by sharing carefully selected personal details about his own difficult childhood, his struggles to build a successful business career, his loneliness as a bachelor who'd never found the right woman to settle down with. My old man used to beat me with a leather belt when he came home drunk. Stanley told me one evening as we sat in the hotel's nearly empty lobby. Used to tell me I was worthless, that I'd never amount to anything better than the factory work that was killing him slowly. I swore The revelation made me want to comfort him, to share my own painful experiences with childhood abuse, to create the kind of mutual understanding that might ease both our emotional wounds. I found myself opening up about life with Robert Wheeler, about the systematic violence that had— That's terrible, Elizabeth, Stanley said, reaching across to squeeze my hand with what seemed like genuine sympathy. A sweet, intelligent girl like you should never have been hurt that way. You deserved so much better than what that bastard gave you. His understanding felt like healing medicine for wounds I'd carried for 8 years. When Stanley began talking about my future at the hotel, about management training opportunities, about permanent housing arrangements after I graduated from high school, about us being partners, in expanding the business, I saw possibilities for independence and security, but the predatory pattern that I was too inexperienced to recognize was moving steadily toward its inevitable conclusion. Stanley's touches became more intimate and lasted longer. His comments about my appearance became more explicitly sexual. You're old enough now to understand how the real world operates, he told me during what would be our final private conversation. Sometimes people who care about each other show that caring in special ways that other people might not understand. The assault happened on a Saturday morning in October 1961, when the hotel was nearly empty, except for a few long-term residents who rarely left their rooms before noon. I was cleaning the bathroom in room 237, a detail that remains burned into my memory 47 years later, when Stanley appeared in the doorway with an expression I'd never seen before. The friendly paternal boss who'd been so patient and helpful was gone, replaced by something predatory and dangerous that made every survival instinct I'd developed during childhood scream warnings about immediate physical threat. Elizabeth, he said, stepping inside the bathroom and closing the door behind him. I think it's time you and I had a more adult conversation about your employment situation. The click of the door lock engaging was the sound of my adolescence ending, and my real education in predatory male behavior beginning. In that cramped space, with its harsh fluorescent lighting and industrial cleaning supplies, Stanley revealed his assault was violent and calculated, designed to establish complete dominance while avoiding the kind of visible injuries that might prompt questions from school officials. "Oh, scream all you want." He panted, his breath hot against my ear. "These walls are thick, and there's nobody in this building who gives a damn about some orphan girl from St. Catherine's. You belong to me now, Elizabeth. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for both of us." I fought back as desperately as my 16-year-old body would allow, scratching at his face, with my fingernails kicking at his shins, trying to bite any part of him that came close enough to my mouth. But Stanley was prepared for resistance. He knew exactly how to control a struggling victim without causing damage that would raise inconvenient questions. The attack was interrupted by persistent knocking on the bathroom door, someone calling about a plumbing problem in the room directly below us. Stanley cursed and released me temporarily, hastily straightening his clothes, while I collapsed to the cold tile floor, bleeding from cuts on my mouth and arms where his wedding ring had torn my skin. "Oh, fix yourself up and get back to work," he hissed, tossing me a towel. "And remember what I told you about discretion. Nobody will believe your word against mine, and girls who make trouble for their employers usually end up back on the streets where they belong." But the person knocking on the door wasn't giving up easily. The voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson from the hotel's laundry service, an elderly woman who managed washing and linen distribution 3 days a week. Her persistent demands to check the bathroom's plumbing finally forced Stanley to unlock the door. "Sweet Jesus in heaven." Mrs. Patterson breathed, taking in my battered condition and Stanley's disheveled appearance, with eyes that had clearly seen too much of the world's cruelty to be fooled by his stammered explanations about workplace accidents. Stanley tried to bluster his way out of the situation, claiming I'd slipped and fallen while cleaning, but Mrs. Patterson wasn't buying his lies for a second. She helped me clean my wounds while Stanley retreated to his office, muttering threats about employment consequences and damaged reputations. "Ah, child," Mrs. Patterson said gently as she dabbed blood from my split lip. "You need to tell someone in authority what really happened here. That man is dangerous, and he'll do this again to other girls if someone doesn't stop him." But I was too frightened and too ashamed to consider reporting Stanley's assault to police or social workers. His threats about believability seemed all too plausible. Who would take the word of an institutionalized teenager against a respectable businessman with community connections? I fled the Frontier Hotel without collecting the wages Stanley owed me my torn uniform, providing silent testimony to his violence. When I stumbled through St. Catherine's front door, with tears streaming down my face and blood on my clothes, I should have known. Dorothy said, her voice tight with guilt and barely controlled rage, as the doctor photographed my injuries for potential legal proceedings. "I should have recognized the signs earlier and gotten you away from that monster before he could hurt you." "What signs?" I asked. "Men like Stanley Kowalski leave patterns, Elizabeth. They target vulnerable young women, isolate them from potential support systems, then exploit their dependence and fear. I've seen it before, and I should have been more careful about where I placed you for employment." Dr. Henderson strongly recommended. Dorothy respected my decision, but she also made it crystal clear that my safety was now her absolute top priority. She arranged for me to transfer to full-time work in St. Catherine's kitchen, where I would remain under constant adult supervision, and Stanley won't give up easily. Dorothy warned me with the grim certainty of someone who understood predatory psychology. Men like him see rejection As a personal challenge, Dorothy's prediction proved accurate with terrifying speed. Within days of my escape from the Frontier Hotel, Stanley began a systematic campaign of harassment designed to convince me that resistance was futile and cooperation was my only viable option for survival. He called St. Catherine's repeatedly claiming he needed to discuss my sudden departure and my theft of hotel property, accusations that Sister Margaret firmly rejected, but which created ongoing tension within the children's home administration. He sent letters demanding meetings to resolve. Most disturbing of all, Stanley began appearing at places. "There's that girl from the hotel," he would say loudly when I was buying groceries or checking out library books, speaking to no one in particular, but ensuring that everyone within hearing distance absorbed his implications. Such a shame when troubled kids make up stories to. Stanley was systematically poisoning my reputation in the small community around St. Catherine's, making it impossible for me to find alternative employment or build relationships with adults who might offer protection. His character assassination was calculated to isolate me, making me increasingly dependent on his forgiveness for basic survival needs. The psychological warfare was devastating to my already fragile sense of self-worth. I began losing weight from stress, and lack of appetite developed chronic insomnia that left me exhausted during school hours and found myself jumping at shadows whenever I left the safety of St. Catherine. That's when Dorothy made a decision that would reveal the first hints of secrets she'd been keeping for 8 years. Instead of simply trying to protect me from Stanley's harassment through institutional channels, she began conducting her own investigation into his background and behavioral patterns. "Elizabeth," she said during one of our weekly counseling sessions, "I want you to start documenting every contact Stanley makes with you, every phone call to the home, every time you see him in public places, every comment he makes within your hearing. Write down dates, times, locations, and any witnesses who might have observed his Why, what good will that do? Because predators like Stanley count on their victims being too isolated and too frightened to fight back effectively. But if we can establish a clear pattern of stalking and intimidation, we might be able to get legal authorities to take action, even without your testimony about the assault itself." Dorothy provided me with a small notebook that I carried everywhere, diligently recording Stanley's harassment activities, with the kind of detailed precision that would have impressed professional investigators. But she was also conducting her own parallel research using skills and connections I hadn't known she possessed. "I've spoken with 3 other. Did they tell you what happened?" "They won't discuss specifics, but the pattern is unmistakable. Stanley Kowalski has been preying on vulnerable young women for years, and he's gotten away with it because his victims have been too afraid or too socially isolated to seek help or file complaints." This revelation should have made me feel vindicated, but instead it filled me with crushing guilt and responsibility. If Stanley had hurt other women, if my refusal to cooperate was making him more desperate and dangerous, wasn't I somehow accountable for protecting his future victims from similar trauma? Dorothy seemed to anticipate myself, but even as we compiled documentation of Stanley's harassment, Dorothy was pursuing another investigation that would ultimately prove far more significant for our family's future. She'd been researching missing persons cases from Nebraska, following Elizabeth. Dorothy said one evening as we sat in her small office reviewing our Stanley documentation, "There's something I need to tell you about why I've been so protective of you, so concerned about the men who might try to hurt you." She opened a manila folder I'd never seen before, withdrawing photographs and newspaper clippings, that would begin to explain mysteries I'd carried since childhood. The first item was a faded photograph showing a woman who looked remarkably similar to me, holding a baby whose features were barely visible. "This is your mother, Sarah Miller, when she was 17 years old." Dorothy explained, her voice heavy with emotions she'd apparently been suppressing for years. "And this is your sister Rose, born in 1940 when Sarah was barely more than a child herself." I stared at the photograph in complete shock. I have a sister. Why didn't my mother ever tell me about her? Because Rose disappeared when she was 18 years old, and Sarah spent the rest of her short life believing it was somehow her fault, Dorothy replied. The circumstances of Rose's disappearance were traumatic and dangerous, and Sarah was terrified that talking about it might put you at risk from the same people. The next revelation hit me like a physical blow that left me gasping for breath. Dorothy pulled out a birth certificate and several other official documents that established family connections I'd never imagined possible. "Elizabeth," Dorothy said quietly, reaching across to take my hands in hers. "I'm your grandmother." The room seemed to spin around me as I absorbed this impossible information. The woman who'd been my mentor-protector and closest adult relationship for 8 years was actually my blood relative family I'd thought was lost forever when my mother died and Robert's violence had driven me into exile. "Why didn't you tell me when you first found me?" I whispered, barely able to form the words. "Because I wasn't sure you could handle the emotional complexity, and I was afraid of what might happen if certain dangerous people learned about our relationship," Dorothy replied. "I failed to protect Sarah from violence that destroyed her life. Dorothy's story unfolded over the next several hours, like a painful confession that had been waiting years to be spoken aloud. She told me about Rose's disappearance from Grand Island, Nebraska in 1943, when my sister was 18 years old and working at a canning factory to support our struggling family. Rose was attacked by her supervisor at the factory," Dorothy explained, showing me newspaper clips. "Morrison had apparently threatened Rose with violence against our family if she testified against him in court. Rather than put Dorothy and Sarah at risk from his criminal associates, Rose had fled Grand Island in the middle of the night, leaving behind only a brief note saying she needed to disappear permanently to keep everyone else safe from I've been searching for Rose ever since," Dorothy said, her voice breaking with years of accumulated grief and guilt. "But she covered her tracks too thoroughly. Changed her name, left no forwarding addresses, disappeared so completely that even private investigators couldn't find any trace of where she'd gone." Meanwhile, Sarah had eventually married Robert Wheeler, trying to build some semblance of stable family life, despite the trauma of losing her sister and the constant fear that Morrison's threats might still be active. But Robert's alcoholism and violent tendencies had created a different kind of danger that ultimately proved just as destructive as the criminal predation Rose had fled. When I heard rumors about a woman named Sarah Wheeler, who died of tuberculosis in rural Nebraska, leaving behind a young daughter with an abusive stepfather, I knew immediately that it had to be my Sarah. Dorothy explained. "I started following the trail of what had happened to you, tracking leads through social workers." Dorothy's investigation had taken her through multiple states and dozens of false leads before she finally learned that a girl matching my description had been rescued by a cattle hauler and brought to Denver. She'd spent months systematically visiting every children's home in the metropolitan area before finding me at St. Catherine's. "But I couldn't simply walk in and claim you as my granddaughter," Dorothy said. "I had no legal standing, no way to prove our relationship without extensive documentation that might have attracted attention from people I was trying to avoid. So I applied to volunteer at the home, positioning myself to watch over you while keeping our blood connection. The explanation answered so many questions about Dorothy's behavior over the years, her fierce protectiveness that went beyond normal volunteer dedication, her extensive knowledge of my personal background, her careful preparation for dangers I might face as a young woman entering the adult world. "And then Rose," I asked, "is there any chance she might still be alive?" "I desperately hope so," Dorothy replied. "But finding her after 18 years will be extremely difficult. She could be anywhere in the country using any name, living any kind of life she's chosen to build." But Dorothy's investigation files contained one tantalizing lead that might provide hope for eventually locating Rose. Among her newspaper clippings was a recent article from the Omaha World Herald about a women's shelter that had opened in that city founded by someone identified as Ruth Morrison. A woman. Morrison was the surname of Rose's attacker, I said, studying the article carefully. Why would she use it? Sometimes victims adopt their attacker's identity as a form of psychological ownership, Dorothy explained. It's a way of reclaiming power from someone who tried to destroy your sense of self. If Rose became Ruth Morrison, she might. The photograph accompanying the newspaper article showed a woman whose features were partially obscured by shadows, but there was something about her posture and facial structure that made Dorothy's hands tremble as she examined it with a magnifying glass. "The age would be exactly right," Dorothy whispered. "The location makes geographical sense, but before we could investigate this potential connection to Rose, we had a more immediate crisis to address. Stanley Kowalski's harassment campaign was escalating beyond psychological intimidation into territory that suggested physical violence might be imminent. He'd begun following me more closely when I left St. Catherine's grounds, no longer maintaining the discreet distance that had characterized his earlier stalking behavior. He'd also started making increasingly explicit comments about. The breaking point came on Halloween night 1961, when Stanley appeared at St. Catherine's annual community festival, a public event that should have been completely safe from his harassment. He mingled with parents and local supporters. "What's he doing here?" I whispered to Dorothy as we watched Stanley engage Sister Margaret in what appeared to be a pleasant conversation about charitable giving and community service. "He's escalating his psychological campaign," Dorothy replied grimly. "He's no longer content with intimidating you from a distance. Now he's invading spaces that should be sanctuary, demonstrating that nowhere is safe from his attention." That night, as volunteers cleaned up after the festival, Stanley managed to corner me in the storage room, where I was gathering folded chairs and tables. The space was isolated from the main building, and the sounds of other people working wouldn't carry far enough for anyone to hear calls for help. "Elizabeth," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him with deliberate precision, "I think it's time we finished that conversation we started at the hotel." The storage room felt like a tomb as Stanley closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch engaging, echoing off concrete walls lined with cleaning supplies and folded furniture. My heart hammered against my ribs as "Stay away from me," I said, gripping a folding chair like a weapon while backing toward the room's far corner. "Mrs. Patterson knows I'm in here. If I don't come out soon, she'll come looking for me." Stanley's laugh was cold and confident. Dorothy Patterson is busy in the kitchen with the other old ladies cleaning up after tonight's little party. Nobody's going to interrupt us this time, Elizabeth. Nobody's going to save you. He was probably right. The storage room was, but I'd learned something crucial during the months of Stanley's harassment. Fear could be transformed into useful energy if I channeled it toward action rather than allowing it to paralyze me. Instead of cowering like prey waiting for slaughter, I made a decision that would change everything. I threw the folding chair directly at Stanley's head with every ounce of strength my 16-year-old body could generate. The metal chair caught him square in the face, breaking his nose with a wet cracking sound and sending blood streaming down his white shirt. Stanley staggered backward, cursing and clutching his injured face while I bolted. "You little bitch!" Stanley roared, his voice thick with blood and murderous rage. "I'll kill you for this! I'll fucking kill you!" But I was already running, my feet pounding across St. Catherine's grounds toward the main building, where Dorothy was indeed working in the kitchen. Behind me, Stanley's voice grew louder and more incoherent, with fury making detailed threats about what he would do when he caught me, threats that would provide excellent documentation for Dorothy. I screamed as I burst through the kitchen doors, my voice breaking with terror and desperate relief. I stopped short when I saw her expression. Dorothy wasn't surprised or confused by my panicked entrance. Instead, her weathered face showed grim determination mixed with something that looked almost like grim satisfaction, as if she'd been preparing for this exact moment throughout our month. Get behind me, Elizabeth," Dorothy said with deadly calm, pulling a large carving knife from the dish-drying rack beside the industrial. Stanley appeared in the kitchen doorway, with blood still streaming from his shattered nose, his face contorted with the kind of homicidal rage that goes far beyond rational anger into genuine psychopathic territory. But when he saw Dorothy standing between him and me, armed with an 8-inch blade and obviously prepared to use lethal force, "Mrs. Patterson," he said, carefully pressing a blood-soaked handkerchief against his nose, "let's not do anything we'll regret here. The girl attacked me." Dorothy's laugh was sharp as the steel in her hand. "Employment situation. Is that what you call cornering teenage girls in isolated rooms, Stanley? Is that your definition of reasonable conversation?" "You don't understand what's been happening." Stanley continued, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he'd used so effectively during his grooming campaign. "Elizabeth has been fabricating stories about me, spreading malicious rumors to cover her own." "I understand the situation perfectly," Dorothy replied, moving closer to Stanley with the knife held in a position that suggested extensive familiarity with using blades as weapons. "You're a sexual predator who targets vulnerable young women. You've been doing it for years, probably decades, and you thought Elizabeth would be another easy victim because she's alone in the world with no family to protect her." Stanley's eyes darted between Dorothy's determined face and the kitchen's multiple exit points, calculating odds and escape routes with the desperate cunning of someone who realized his carefully constructed facade was crumbling around him. "You're both insane if you think anyone will believe this fantasy," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I'm a respected businessman with an established reputation in this community. She's a disturbed teen." That's when Dorothy revealed the information that would shatter Stanley's confidence completely and expose the full extent of the preparation she'd been conducting for months. "Actually, Stanley, I'm considerably more than just some random volunteer. Dorothy said, her voice carrying the weight of secrets she'd kept hidden for years. I'm Elizabeth's grandmother, and I've been documenting your predatory behavior since the day you first laid hands on her. Stanley's face went white beneath the blood as he processed this revelation. He'd assumed I was completely alone in the world with no family connections or support systems that might complicate his plans for ongoing abuse. You've been watching me, Stanley said, understanding dawning in his predator's eyes. This whole job placement was a setup from the beginning. Not a setup, Dorothy corrected grimly. A test. I needed to see exactly what kind of man you were before I could determine the best way to stop you permanently. She reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a thick manila envelope that made Stanley's remaining color drain completely from his face. I have photographs of you following Elizabeth to school, recordings of your threatening phone calls to St. Catherine's, and sworn statements from 4 other women. Stanley's confident facade cracked completely as he realized the scope of evidence that had been compiled against him. His harassment campaign hadn't been conducted in the shadows, as he'd believed every move had been observed, documented, and prepared for legal prosecution. None of that will hold up in court, Stanley said desperately. You can't prove anything that would convince a jury to convict a respectable businessman. Perhaps not, Dorothy admitted. But I don't need a conviction to stop you from hurting other young women, Stanley. I just need you to disappear. That's when Stanley made his fatal mistake. Instead of attempting to negotiate some kind of face-saving retreat, instead of recognizing that he'd been thoroughly outmaneuvered by an opponent he'd dramatically underestimated, he chose violence as his final option. He lunged toward Dorothy with the desperate fury of a cornered animal, his hands reaching for the knife, while his superior size and weight seemed to give him advantage in close combat. But Dorothy had been preparing for this moment as well, and her response revealed. The carving knife slid between Stanley's ribs with surgical precision, finding the gap between bone and muscle that would cause maximum damage while avoiding immediately fatal injury. Stanley collapsed to the "Call an ambulance," Dorothy told me calmly as sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Tell them we have a stabbing victim who needs immediate medical. Stanley tried to speak, but shock and blood loss had left him barely conscious. As police officers and paramedics crowded into St. Catherine's kitchen, I realized that Dorothy's months of careful preparation had achieved something I'd thought impossible. Detective Ray Martinez was the first investigator to examine Dorothy's documentation, his experienced eyes recognizing immediately the thoroughness and professionalism of her evidence compilation. Mrs. Patterson, he said after reviewing the manila envelope's contents, this is some of the most comprehensive stalking documentation I've ever seen. With this level of evidence plus the victim testimony you've gathered, Stanley Kowalski is looking at serious prison time even if he survives his injuries. But Dorothy's victory came with a price that none of us had anticipated. As paramedics worked to stabilize Stanley for transport to Denver General Hospital, he regained consciousness long enough to make one final attempt at psychological manipulation. Dorothy, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the medical equipment. You think you've won something here, but you have no idea what you've really done. Elizabeth isn't the only member of your family I've had contact with over the years. The words sent ice through my veins as their implications became clear. Stanley was suggesting he had information about Rose about my sister's fate during the 18 years she'd been You're lying, Dorothy said, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. You've never been anywhere near Grand Island or Omaha. You couldn't know anything about Rose? Stanley's smile was weak, but genuinely malicious. Ask Ruth Morrison in Omaha about her old friend Stanley Kowalski, he whispered as paramedics lifted his stretcher. Ask her about the hotel manager who's been sending her anonymous letters. The revelation hit both Dorothy and me like physical blows. If Stanley had been in contact with Rose, if he'd been using knowledge of our family connections as part of some larger psychological torture campaign, then his predatory behavior was far more complex. As the ambulance pulled away from St. Catherine's carrying Stanley toward whatever justice awaited him, Dorothy and I were left with the stunning possibility that our search for Rose might be over, and that the reunion we'd dreamed of. The phone call came 3 days after Stanley's arrest, while he was still in intensive care at Denver General Hospital, recovering from the knife wound Dorothy had inflicted during our confrontation. Mrs. Patterson, Detective Martinez said when Dorothy answered the phone in Sister Margaret's office. I've got news about Ruth Morrison in Omaha. She's agreed to speak with you and Elizabeth, and I think you're going to be very interested in what she has to say. The conversation that followed confirmed our wildest hopes, while simultaneously revealing the full scope of Stanley's psychological cruelty. Ruth Morrison was indeed Rose Miller, my sister Dorothy's daughter, the family member we'd been searching for throughout the 18 years since her death. But Rose's story was more complex and heartbreaking than either Dorothy or I had imagined. She hadn't simply fled Nebraska to escape Edward Morrison's threats. She'd actually been kidnapped by Morrison's criminal associates, held captive for 6 months, in a series of... When I finally got free, Rose explained during our first phone conversation. Rose had indeed adopted her attacker's surname as a form of psychological ownership, but she'd also used that identity to build a network of shelters and support services for other women escaping similar situations. Over the years, she'd helped hundreds of assault survivors rebuild their lives, transforming her own trauma into healing resources for others. The work gave my suffering meaning, Rose said. When you can't save yourself from what happened in the past, sometimes you can save someone else in the present, and that makes the pain bearable. But the most shocking revelation came when Rose explained how Stanley Kowalski had discovered her location and begun his psychological harassment campaign. He'd been sending me anonymous letters for 3 years, Rose said, her voice trembling with remembered fear. Letters that included photographs of you, Elizabeth, and detailed information about your life at St. Catherine's. He knew I was your sister, and he was using that knowledge to torture both of us, threatening you, while simultaneously letting me know that my family was alive but vulnerable. Stanley's predatory behavior had been far more sophisticated and cruel than we'd understood. He hadn't just targeted me as an isolated victim, he'd specifically chosen me because of my connection to Rose, using our family relationship as part of an elaborate revenge scheme against a woman who'd escaped his associates' control decades earlier. He wanted me to know that he could hurt you anytime he chose, Rose explained. But he also wanted me to suffer with the knowledge that trying to protect you might expose your location to other dangerous people from my past. The psychological torture had been devastating for Rose, who'd spent 3 years watching from a distance while Stanley groomed and eventually assaulted me, unable to intervene without potentially making the situation worse. her decision to remain silent while I was being I tried to find ways to protect you without revealing our connection, Rose said through tears that had been building for years. I contacted Dorothy's reaction to learning about Stanley's connection to Rose was a mixture of rage and heartbreak that took weeks to process fully. She thought she was protecting me from a random predator, not realizing that Stanley's targeting of our family was part of a larger pattern of psychological warfare that had been ongoing for years. If I'd known about the letters, Dorothy said during one of our planning sessions for traveling to Omaha, I would have handled the situation very differently. Stanley was never just an opportunistic predator, he was conducting a deliberate campaign of family terrorism. But Dorothy's decisive action in stopping Stanley had achieved more than just protecting me from further assault. By exposing his predatory behavior and ensuring his imprisonment, she'd eliminated Stanley himself never fully recovered from Dorothy's knife attack. He developed complications from his injuries that left him permanently disabled, though he survived long enough to be convicted on multiple charges of sexual assault, stalking, and criminal harassment. The trial that followed made headlines throughout Colorado. Mr. Kowalski, Judge Samuel Foster, said during sentencing, "Your crimes represent a particularly sophisticated form of psychological terrorism that goes far beyond simple sexual assault. You deliberately targeted vulnerable young women as part of systematic campaigns designed to maximize psychological damage to entire." Stanley was sentenced to 30 years in prison without possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm vulnerable women or terrorize families through elaborate predatory schemes. But more importantly, for our family's healing process, Stanley's conviction created space for Dorothy, Rose, and me to begin rebuilding relationships that had been severed by years of trauma and fear. Our first meeting in Omaha was emotional chaos, tears, laughter, disbelief, and overwhelming joy, all mixed together as 3 generations of women who'd been separated by violence finally embraced in the lobby of Rose's women's shelter. Rose was 39 years old, then a woman whose features clear. "You look so much like Sarah," Rose said, studying my face through tears while we held each other for the first time since I was born. "But there's something else there too, a strength that Sarah never had the chance to develop. You survived things that might have destroyed her completely." "Well, we all survived," I replied, looking between Rose and Dorothy with profound gratitude for the family connections I'd thought were lost forever. "And now we can help each other heal from what we've been through." The conversations that followed lasted through several days of intensive family reconnection as we shared stories of trauma and survival that created understanding across decades of separation. Rose told us, most importantly, we began planning a future that would allow us to remain connected while respecting the individual healing journeys each of us needed to complete. Rose would continue. For my own part, I was finally free to pursue the educational and career goals that had seemed impossible when I was focused simply on survival. With my family's support and guidance from victim advocacy organizations, I enrolled at the University of Colorado to study social work with plans to specialize in helping other families recover from domestic violence and sexual assault. "You have insights that most social workers lack," Rose told me during one of her visits to Denver. "You understand what it feels like to be completely alone and terrified, and that understanding will make you incredibly effective at helping other people recognize their own strength and resilience." The scholarship I received was partially funded by restitution money recovered from Stanley's criminal activities, a form of justice that transformed his stolen wealth into educational resources for one of his victims. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, but the most profound healing came from the simple fact of family reunion itself. For the first time since my mother's death, I belonged to something larger and more permanent than institutional care or temporary employment arrangements. Dorothy's fierce protectiveness, Rose's hard-won wisdom about surviving trauma, and my own emerging understanding of how to transform suffering into strength created a family unit that could face whatever challenges the future might bring. On my 18th birthday, Dorothy presented me with a locket that had belonged to her grandmother, a piece of jewelry that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in our family. The locket contained photographs of all 5 generations: Dorothy's grandmother, whom I'd never known, Dorothy herself, my mother Sarah, Rose, and me. "This represents something men like Stanley Kowalski can never understand," Dorothy said as she fastened the chain around my neck. "They think violence gives them power over other people's lives, but real strength comes from surviving violence and using that survival to protect others who are facing similar dangers. That's what the women in our family do, Elizabeth." As I write these words now, 47 years after that 18th birthday, I can see the truth of Dorothy's prediction reflected throughout my own life and career. I married David Martinez, Detective Ray Martinez's younger brother, a man. My career in social work allowed me to help establish support services for hundreds of families trying to escape the kind of violence that nearly destroyed mine. Rose and I collaborated on several projects over the years, combining her expertise in running shelters with my knowledge of child protection services to create comprehensive programs for family healing. Dorothy lived to be 89 years old, surrounded by the extended family she'd fought so hard to reunite and protect. Her final words to me were about choosing love over fear, protection over revenge, and hope over despair in every decision that shapes a human life. Rose continued her work with assault survivors until her retirement at 67, when she moved to Colorado Springs to be closer to Dorothy and me during Dorothy's final years. She never married or had biological children of her own, but she helped raise thousands of women who found strength and healing through her guidance and support. The little girl who fled Robert Wheeler's farm at age 8 grew into a woman who understood that survival isn't just about enduring trauma. It's about transforming that experience into wisdom and resources that can help others avoid or overcome similar harm. The cycle of violence that had shaped previous generations of women in our family ended with us replaced by cycles of healing protection and the fierce determination to ensure that some wounds once properly treated. Our story doesn't end with perfect happiness, because real life doesn't offer such simple resolutions. But it ends with something far more valuable: the knowledge that human connections forged through shared struggle can overcome even the most systematic attempts to destroy them, and that courage to fight back against evil can create ripples of positive change that extend far beyond any individual life or family. The monsters who tried to destroy us: Robert Wheeler, Stanley Kowalski, Edward Morrison are all dead now, their capacity for harm ended by time, justice, and the consequences of their own violent choices. But the family they tried to destroy through violence and intimidation, this is the legacy of the women who refused to surrender: Dorothy, who searched for 18 years to reunite her family; Rose, who transformed her own trauma into healing resources for other survivors; and me, who learned that the little girl crying in a pig pen could grow into a woman capable of protecting other children